for the truth. Bring it on.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Do you want the whole truth? I don't think you're ready.
Governments don't control things. A government can't control the economy without controlling people.
It's Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth.
Well, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. We're glad you're here, right here on the AFR Talk Network. I'm Crane Durham. This is Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth. And a lot of news has come out as of late, and corrections abound. We'll get to that, dealing with the Navy shooting, as well as our guest, Dr. Zhudi Jasser. He'll be with us momentarily. He is a Navy veteran and has actually worked in the base that was attacked, or the Navy Yard that was attacked. That said, Carol Costello could not remember the last time a military installation had been hit by one of these attacks. From CNN yesterday. Roll it.
I used to work in Washington, live in Washington. This seems so unusual to me that a gunman could create this kind of havoc at a U.S. military facility.
Yes.
Have you ever heard of it happening before, Brian?
I'm sorry, Carol, I missed that question. Could you repeat it, please?
No, I was just saying that this is so unusual because this is such a heavily secured military facility. I worked in Washington for many years. I'd never heard of such a thing happening.
Well, we haven't either in this area, Carol. This is the first time we've seen something like this, at least in many, many years now. Of course, you remember the Fort Hood shooting in 2009, where that was a member of the service who was convicted eventually of doing that shooting.
All right, so that is Carol Costello yesterday. Now, arguably, some have defended her and said, hey, look, she was referring specifically to Washington, D.C. and being a base, as well as the extreme gun laws there, the restrictions on guns. That said, not being able to remember. So how did this exactly happen? How did what seems and reportedly is one madman, a man who was hearing voices, get on the Naval Yard and end up killing 12 other people? Our guest, Dr. Zhudi Jasser, he is the founder and president of American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He is the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim's Patriot's Fight to Save His Faith. And Dr. Jasser, thank you so much for making time for us tonight. Great to be with you.
Thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
Always. You're always welcome. Sir, you served. You're a Navy veteran. I've never served in uniform, and we look at this from the outside, but you have an insider's view, obviously, in your service. Were you surprised at how a man with a gun got on the base and through security and was able to create this awful devastation?
I have to tell you no, and that while there's certain security at most bases with, gates and guards with military police, and you have to have the right ID, it's not the type of security that we see, for example, in our embassies overseas now, or the type of security that I think should be had, let alone on bases where military personnel are not even allowed to carry weapons. And yet, now as a private citizen, I'm able to carry a weapon here in Arizona by my constitutional rights, and yet our armed servicemen and women are not able to because they're quote-unquote not in theater. And yet the security is really not what it should be, and we saw this not only in Fort Hood, where a major psychiatrist ended up killing 13 and wounding over 30. We've seen that at the National Guard stations in Arizona and Arkansas, where we saw the murder. Fort Dix was almost going to be attacked. We saw the cell that was broken up, the arrests and convictions made in the Fort Dix plot. There's just, the front lines have changed in this war. They're no longer abroad. Our armed servicemen and women are now on the front line by virtue of them being in uniform and people viewing them as a way to get back at the United States. So, our prayers go out to the families. But I hope we can start, and let me just tell you one thing firsthand. I served from 1988 to 1999. My last duty station was as a physician to Congress, and I was a doctor on duty at the U.S. Capitol on July 24th, 1998, when Russell Weston shot his way into the Capitol. He killed 3 officers, 2 Capitol Hill police officers, and 1 security guard for Tom DeLay. And that was 20 yards from our medical office. We ran around, and me and 4 corpsmen provided first response to all of the injured there. I mean, actually, the police tackled us initially because we didn't know that the gunman had not been down yet. So I had first-hand experience, and that's the closest I ever got to terrorism. Russell Weston ended up being a psychiatrically ill individual that just shot his way in. But if you look at the Capitol today, since I've left the military, it's changed. The visitor center now is very far from the Capitol. You have multiple layers before the regular public can get through into the Capitol. It's still the public's building. They haven't changed that much, but it's a lot smarter in its security.
Tell me, why did this policy get put in, this out-of-theater policy? What was the reasoning behind it? Because I understand it took place in 1993 through President Clinton. Your thoughts on what was the genesis of the change?
That's a good question. You can get a number of different answers. There's those that talked about domestic violence and other things that happen with PTSD concerns, and I would disagree with a lot of the threat that they think that poses. There are others that say that, the military is to protect us from foreign enemies, so when they're on our base, when they're in our country or on base, they should not be walking around like a police state. So there's these perception issues. And I can tell you, I somewhat understand that, having come from a family that left Syria, and escaped there. There are military on every corner with machine guns on their shoulders, and it's a form of intimidation. So I can see that. But America has a long history of being a democracy and having a constitution and a civilian-run government. So, I think we need to be smart and not just based on appearances.
Amen. And we don't need to grade on style, but another subject for another day, my friend. Can we shift the conversation? I know originally I had you on to discuss what took place because you are a Navy veteran, and I wanted to get your experience, and obviously what you have stated, you've had experience, awful experience in the sense of dealing with these types of acts. But with that said, there was a decision made by President Obama and the administration to go with Vladimir Putin in regard to the Syrian chemical weapons program and the acknowledgement that they had them and the securing of them. And now we've shifted even more, because now the statements are President Obama is arming the rebels, quote unquote, and people are saying that he has chosen Al-Qaeda, that this was his plan even all along, never planned to use military force. I look at this in many different respects, Dr. Jasser, as being wrong in many ways, but you're the expert. Your family is originally from Syria. You've served your country, our country, and my question is, what do you make of the statements that are being made today and the policy that now we are following in regard to Syria?
It's, I think, a very sad day in the annals of American history that we have basically abrogated our superpower status to the has-beens and the corrupt KGB former head in Russia, a nation which has become not only a rogue state of Syria, but whose government has clearly been committing a genocide now, is, I think, laughing at the end of the day. The Assad family, I have family in Damascus and Aleppo, and they're living day to day hearing missiles and bombs go off and not knowing when their house is next. And all of a sudden you see a president, leader of the free world, who they heard in August 2011, which at the time, by the way, they thought was late, in which President Obama said that our policy was regime change, and that Assad, for all practical purposes, was dead man walking, and that we were trying to endorse the opposition. And we said, well, there's no political solution. There had already been 20,000 dead by that time, and that the peaceful revolution had no hope for anything but to see Assad leave. We had asked for a no-fly zone. We had asked the same president that did what he did in Libya before even 2,000 were dead, in which he said that he was preventing a massacre, seeing a massacre happening from town to town in Syria, say that, well, right now we just have words that it's regime change. Now, all of a sudden, 2.5 years later, he gives a speech 24 months late, and in that speech he changes the policy to not regime change, but rather punishment. And then in that same speech says, well, we may have other options, and now it's not punishment. It's like, so basically Assad saved his hide by using chemical weapons. By using the weapons, he then changed our policy from being regime change to being just getting rid of his weapons, which, by the way, there's nothing that comes out of the Assad family's mouths that's true, and ultimately they're just liars and are using this to buy themselves time. And, this is a sad day in American strength. And if you're free Syrian looking for help, they're going to, I can tell you our families and others who are not Islamists, they're not Al-Qaeda, they're not Assad Ba'athist fascists, they're looking for a third pathway. This is not just two choices in Syria, there are multiple choices. But the worst path ahead is Assad, and there has to be a pathway forward. But now they're not looking at America anymore. They're looking at Saudi Arabia, at Qatar, clearly countries that are not going to be helping our allies.
Could you speak, you've put your life on the line, I don't think I'm overstating that, in opposing Islamists in our country with groups. You started your own group, American Islamic Forum for Democracy. You wrote the book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. And in the discussion, you just said there's a third choice. I want you to speak to, largely, we're predominantly a Christian audience here, Dr. Jasser. But I think I know I've been made aware through you, through many others who've done extraordinary work in reaching out to people who desire to be free in the Middle East, regardless of their religion. Please speak to them and explain that there are Muslims who desire to be free. I'm sorry to even have to put it in that way, and the fact that there are leaders that reject Al-Qaeda, reject this nonsense, don't lump them all in, and go with a third way. If you wouldn't mind, sir, please speak.
Well, I think the evidence number one is, let's look at Egypt quick. Egypt, which was a country much more penetrated by the Brotherhood where it was founded, ultimately you had a revolution in March 2011 that said we don't want dictatorship. Mubarak was not only a autocratic secular dictator, but he was obviously an American ally, but he clearly was running a military dictatorship. They reached out and defeated him and said that they wanted something different. They then went to the elections. Mubarak and his predecessors had for decades snuffed out the real liberals, which were the first targets of those types of regimes, and what was left was the Brotherhood, which was organized, and they won an election purely by getting 25% of the vote. But the proof in Egypt, it took only 1 year before you had 10 times the numbers come out and say, we don't want Islamism. They rejected the Brotherhood and demanded that they be removed because they were worried if you leave it 3 more years, what's going to happen? Well, Syria is much more diverse than Egypt. The Brotherhood is not as strong. Syria has 10% Christians, 10% Alawite, some Shiite community, and Sunni Muslims, and also 10% Kurds, which could have been a formula for a very diverse country. And yet what's happened is they've become radicalized, and the narrative that, as we see now in Syria, which is the dictators release the evil of radicalism and start to barrage normal neighborhoods into having no other options but to work with basically what I call a Darwin doctrine, where the most vicious survive, has basically prevented the masses from being able to speak out. And if you look at Islamic knowledge in the region and scholars that have spoken out in my book, I named some of them that taught my parents and my grandfather, who worked with a secular democratic party called the People's Party out of Aleppo before it was hijacked by some socialist movements under the Ba'ath. But ultimately, there is the fabric of those who've been educated in the West that came back and want to be faithful Muslims but don't want theocracy.
And desire to be free. Dr. Jasser, we're out of time, but thank you for taking it with us tonight, sir. Great to be with you.
Attention all Christian